Forever and a Day. The bookstore was closed on Sunday, but Mary spent much of the morning sitting behind the counter watching the clock. She didn't want to go home because that was the first place that Sam would go looking for her. And what was she supposed to tell him? How could she explain why she ran out of his apartment without sounding like a madwoman? She also didn't want to be alone. The image of Harvey on the television screen haunted her, even after she'd had a night to let it sink in and allow herself to make excuses for what it might have been. When she wasn't staring at the clock, Mary was looking out the window, counting the number of people who looked like someone she knew. A man whose nose reminded her of Joe, or a woman whose hair looked like Vasia's. She even counted the number of women whose appearance closely resembled her own. She came to the conclusion that there were only so many variations on the human face, and everyone fit into a certain mold. She tried to comfort herself with this thought by telling herself that the man she saw on the television was not Harvey at all, but she couldn't get the image of that man out of her head. She had been shaken by it long before she ever saw the picture of Harvey in Sam's apartment, because something about that man was not right. Of course, if he was dead, that would go a long way in explaining what wasn't right about him. It would also go a long way in ensuring that Mary would never sleep another night in her life. She felt as though she had been sitting in the store all day, and it wasn't even noon. She hadn't slept much the night before. All she wanted was for the night to come, so she could bring Sam to the bar and have him meet Joe. Even if Joe never saw a ghost in his life, she felt like he was the one person in her life that could make sense of what she had seen. If there was a ghost around Sam, Joe would certainly be able to feel something. He had to. At 11 o'clock, Mary could no longer sit in the store by herself, waiting. She needed to talk to someone. She needed to distract herself from what she had seen. Vasia was covering for a waitress at a diner, not too far from the bookstore. Mary decided to go there and sit. At least then she would have other people around her. She could distract herself by listening to their conversations and judging them based on the fragments that she overheard. As she left the store and turned to lock the door behind her, Mary caught a glimpse of Sam's reflection in the door's glass. He was walking toward her. She paused for a moment, staring at him. Part of her was relieved to see him. She found that she was more at ease around him than just about anyone in the world, most of the time. Even if she hadn't known him for very long, she was happier when he was there. But another part of her wanted to pretend that she hadn't seen him. She wanted to rush into the store, lock the door behind her, and hide in the office until he went away. Also that she wouldn't have to explain to him what she was thinking. By the time she stopped looking at him and turned her attention to the key in the door's lock once again, Sam was standing right behind her, staring at her reflection. He didn't say anything. Even though Mary wasn't looking at him, she could feel his eyes on her. She froze in place, trying to think of the right thing to say or do. Finally, she decided to avoid the topic of his cousin entirely and pretend that it never happened. She smiled and said to him, "I wasn't sure that you were going to want to see me again after I ran out on you last night." "I was worried," he replied. "Are you all right? Did Sid say something?" Her eyes finally met his in the reflection, and she shook her head as she said, "No, Sid was just fine. It was me. I think the excitement of the day finally caught up with me and I sort of felt sick, that's all. I didn't want you to see me like that." "Are you feeling better?" She nodded. "Good. Because I was hoping that we could spend some time together today, just the two of us this time." "What did you have in mind?" "The park," he told her. "I was hoping that we could have lunch and enjoy the sunshine for the day. We're both locked up inside all week." "That would be nice," she replied, still feeling an urge to avoid spending time with him until she could be certain that she wouldn't blurt out a comment about having seen his dead cousin. Except she didn't want to avoid him. She turned around and looked him in the eyes, smiling as she said, "I told my brother-in-law that I wanted him to meet you tonight." Sam leaned back just slightly, still with a smile in his eyes, but he tilted his head as he asked, "Meeting the family so soon?" "There's not much left to meet," she joked back. The comment wasn't meant to kill the light mood of the day, but as soon as she said it, Sam's eyes lost that hint of a smile, and he became very somber as he took her hand and said, "Okay, I want to meet him." 8 o'clock? At the bar?" she asked, and he nodded his response. They started to walk down the sidewalk together, and all of Mary's concerns began to shrink away. She was confident that she could make it through the day without accidentally mentioning ghosts, as long as she was careful. "So, tell me about Joe," Sam said, in a tone that sounded slightly intimidated. "Is he the sort of man who's likely to punch me in the face for looking at his little sister?" Mary couldn't help but laugh. Joe spent a few hours with Annalise that day. He had time to not only ask her about the search for her sister, but to get to know Annalise herself. He found her to be an interesting woman once he got past her personality. She was a walking contradiction. She was angry and defensive. She didn't like anyone, it seemed. She didn't trust people. She was, in many ways, very bitter. Yet there was another side to her. She enjoyed their time together. She had fun talking with him about neckties and scratched-up shoes. She took an interest in his life, though he tried his best to keep a few of the details to himself. He didn't want to talk about his family. He didn't want to talk about how he had ended up in the newspaper and how people had been coming to him, begging for help. He didn't like talking about his helping people because it felt wrong to him. He didn't set out to find the Dowling boy. He simply happened upon the situation. Most people would have ignored it, Annalise told him, after his attempt to avoid the subject failed. "You should take credit for the things you do. For every person I help, there are 100 that I don't." She rolled her eyes at him and said, "For every 100 that you don't, there is one that you do. I'm not a hero." "No, but you have something that most people don't. It's yours, and you shouldn't be afraid to exploit it." "Exploit it?" "You could make money with it if you wanted to. You could help people, or you could hurt people. Knowing how someone feels means knowing their weakness. That gives you power." "I don't want power." "Everyone wants power. I just want a normal life." "How has that worked for you so far?" she asked pointedly. "If someone has given you this ability, don't you think you were intended to use it? To hone your ability, like any artist or scientist would?" "To what end?" "Say you were a lawyer or a police officer. You could lead the witness during questioning, getting them to talk about topics they're trying to avoid just by knowing when they're getting uncomfortable." "I've never been good at manipulating people." "It's not as hard as it looks." "Oh?" "Women manipulate men all the time. Even our faces aren't really our faces. And once you marry us, do you really think that we're going to keep being the sweet and complacent girl that you fell in love with?" Joe could have told her a thing or two about being married. Norma hadn't changed. If anything, it was the other way around. She was a good and loving woman who tried her best to handle an impossible situation. He was the one who failed her. She never manipulated him a day in her life. "Oh," Annalise said, stopping in her tracks and wincing with pain as she turned toward him. "I didn't mean to. I'm sorry, Joe." "It's fine," he assured her, and pressed on. They left Macy's and walked up the street, going nowhere in particular. The sun was shining, and Joe's eyes went toward the deep blue sky. The honking horns and crowded sidewalk seemed less constricting to him as he stared at the sky, pushing everything else aside. "A penny for your thoughts," Annalise said, looking toward the sky, but not appearing to see it in the same way that he did. Walking in silence for several minutes didn't hold the same appeal for her. "I'm just remembering when I was a kid. The sky seemed a lot bigger back then." "How so?" "I didn't grow up in the city. I lived in the country, not far from a mountain. If you went up to the top of the mountain, there was a park with a lookout. You could see for miles, and the sky stretched out forever." "You prefer the country to the city?" "Yes." "Why did you move?" "Norma had family here. I didn't want to keep her away from them." "What about your family?" "They're gone." "Oh," Annalise said softly. Joe could feel her trying to maneuver around the sensitive subject. Finally, she said, "I know how that feels, to be alone." A wave of emotion ran through her as she spoke those words, anger and sadness, love and bitter hatred. They fell into another silence. This time the quiet was somber, as though neither one of them knew how to pull their conversation out of the hole that they had dug for it. After several moments of that, Annalise decided to change the atmosphere. She pointed up the street and said to Joe, "I want to show you something." She led the way as they moved forward, narrowly avoiding bumping into people, pushing the limits of her ability to walk. Eventually, she led Joe right into the Empire State Building. Though he had seen the building many times from the outside, Joe had never been inside of it. Now he found himself standing breathless in the building's lobby, surrounded by marble, gold, and aluminum, staring up at an image of the building itself, which was bathed in golden rays of light. Normally, Joe was unimpressed by architecture. A building was a building, and if it served its purpose, that was good enough for him. However, this was more like a work of art than any building he had ever seen. If the lobby of the building had been all that there was to see, Joe would have been impressed. But Annalise guided him forward, toward the elevator. She waited for just the right moment, once they were inside of the elevator, before she turned to Joe and told him, "I used to stand on the street with my sister as they were building this place. I used to watch the workers toss rivets to each other, which were still so hot that they were glowing white. I watched them walk on the beams as each floor went up, and no matter how high they got, they walked as though there was solid ground beneath their feet, without a moment of fear or hesitation." As she spoke, Joe heard a sense of wonder in Annalise's voice that he had never heard before. She spoke of those memories as though she could see them playing out right before her eyes. "My sister always cringed as she watched them. She couldn't stand to look all the way up at them. It made her feel as though she was going to fall herself. But I watched them, and I wanted what they had. I wanted to walk that freely. I wanted to catch fire in my hand." She looked at Joe as the images in her head faded away, and she smiled. She said, "I suppose that seems silly. Obviously, I wouldn't make a very good construction worker. But the moment they opened the building, I wanted to come inside and see what they saw." The elevator doors opened on the 86th floor, and Annalise stepped out first, eager to get to where she was going, and ignoring the pain that shot through her, trying its best to slow her down. Joe caught up with her and took her arm, easing some of the stress on her injured body. She led him out onto the terrace and took a deep breath of the fresh air. Joe was astonished. He had never been on anything so high in his entire life. He stepped as close to the edge as he could get and looked out into the distance, marveling at the beauty. "Welcome to our version of a mountain," she said to him. He couldn't help but smile as he looked out at the sky, which stretched on forever. After spending the day in the park, Mary had to go home and get changed if she wanted to make it to the bar in time for her shift. Sam dropped her off at the door to her building, and part of her was hoping that he would kiss her again, though it would be entirely inappropriate for him to try. She could only imagine what Tibby Lawther, the woman who managed her building, would say if she saw Mary kiss Sam right there on the front steps. Mary had known Tibby since she was 2 years old, and the woman could give her a stare which would send a chill up Mary's spine, even after she was grown and living by herself. Mary had never thought of Tibby as a close friend or a mother figure, but Tibby always wanted to believe that she was the moral authority for the Daniels girls. On more than one occasion, she snitched on the girls to their mother, resulting in severe punishment. Sam didn't try to kiss her. He never would have done that, given the type of man he was. Still, part of Mary wished that he would at least try. She hurried to her apartment and changed into clothes more suitable to work. While Rummy never enforced any kind of uniform policy, he liked the girls to look presentable, claiming that men bought more drinks from women that they wanted to date. When put in those terms, it made Mary feel dirty. However, Vasya reminded her that men also tipped better when they wanted to date a girl, so Mary's qualms were quickly dashed. As she arrived at the Capitol, it was still light out. Most of the customers wouldn't be arriving for hours, but she had to be there just in case. She approached the door, checking her watch and straightening her blouse, not noticing the man who was walking just behind her. "Pardon me," the man said, startling Mary. She turned and saw Roy, smiling at her as though she would want to see him. "Do you have the time?" he asked, pretending to have a good reason for speaking to her. "It's about 5 minutes past the moment when you should have left me alone." "Now, is that any way to talk to a friend?" "No, it isn't, which is why I would never talk to a friend that way. Now, if you'll excuse me." Mary turned and started to walk toward the door again, but Roy hurried to get ahead of her. As he blocked her path, his sarcastic demeanor was dropped, and he took on a much more earnest expression. I know you're upset with me, and you have every right to be. However, I want you to know that I really am sorry if I stepped over a line, Roy told her. He seemed to mean it too, but Mary didn't have Joe's sense for when people were telling the truth. I accept your apology, she said politely. Now move. She tried to push past him, but Roy didn't budge. He put that smile of his back on his face and leaned against the door, trying to look handsome. He nodded to her and said, See, we're friends again. Now how about we grab lunch together sometime? No. Dinner? I don't think my boyfriend would approve. Boyfriend? Since when? Since the day after he beat you up. I do like my men strong. Ouch, that hurt. I imagine it did. Now please, I have work. Sure. Roy stepped out of the way and allowed Mary to walk toward the door. Just as she put her hand on the knob and prepared to go inside, he said, Of course, he did seem a little boring. You deserve someone with more excitement in their life. Mary stopped and turned around, saying, You mean like a reporter? Exactly. Glad to know we're on the same page. Is that the same page where you lied about my brother-in-law? Now, I didn't lie. Yes, you did. I thought we were past all this. Friends, remember? Fine, Roy. We're friends. We're past all of it. Now could you please let me get to my job in peace? Sure, he smiled. Mary was just about to turn and walk inside when Roy said, Hey. She stopped and rolled her eyes as she turned around, waiting for another clever line. However, Roy's expression shifted to something more sincere than before, and he asked her, Is he good to you? This new fella, I mean. Mary's expression softened as well, and she replied, Yeah, he's maybe the best. To that, Roy smiled and nodded his head, accepting her answer. Then he gave Mary a slight bow, turned, put his hands in his pockets, and walked away. Joe helped Annalise into a taxi once their conversation was over. He walked away from her with a new understanding of the woman that she was, the conflicting emotions, the contradictions in personality. She was a woman in great pain, both physical and emotional, and she had learned to hide that pain from the world. She projected an image of herself to others, but she couldn't hide from Joe. Despite all of her anger and hatred, he met another side of her that day. He met the little girl who watched the Empire State Building go up, with dreams that grew with every level that they added. He met the girl who would let nothing stand in the way of reaching someone she loved, and her determination was something to be respected. After he left Annalise, Joe returned to his own corner of the world and eventually made his way to the capital. He got there a little bit earlier than expected, but the bar was already beginning to fill with its regulars. As soon as Joe walked through the door, Mary spotted him and walked his way. He met her about halfway between the door and the bar. She was nervous. He's not here yet, she told him. Joe nodded. He walked to the bar and took a seat on one of the stools before asking, Does he know why you want him here tonight? No, Mary gasped, as though Joe had just jabbed her with a knife. And you're not going to tell him. You're just going to introduce yourself as my brother-in-law and then make some pleasant conversation. Can I ask him about his intentions? No, you may not. Joe couldn't help but be amused by how nervous Mary was. He had never been the one to intimidate her boyfriends before, but he had been on the other end of that meeting when he met her father, the first time Norma brought him home. He remembered how nervous he was as they neared the apartment building, and how Norma kept giving him notes on what he should say and what he shouldn't. He remembered her telling him to avoid politics when it came to her mother, and avoid talking about the fights when it came to her father. Don't talk about his family, Mary warned him, before pausing to think about anything else that she wanted to add. And don't ask him about his work. I think he's self-conscious about it. He feels inferior, I think. What's he do again? He delivers mail. Joe wasn't sure whether or not he should take offense to the comment about mail carriers being inferior, and he was sure to make a face that reflected his reaction, but Mary was too distracted to notice. Don't mention the military, she added. Why? Is he an enemy spy? Don't make jokes like that. Vasya approached and took a seat next to Joe. She watched as Mary thought hard about her list of topics to avoid, and she seemed to find it as amusing as Joe did. She's been like this all afternoon, Vasya told Joe. Am I really that hard to get along with? Vasya shrugged and said, "You have a way of getting inside the person's head. I thought I hid that pretty well." "Sometimes you do. Other times it feels like you're looking through person." "Sounds creepy." "It is." Joe smiled at the idea that people might find him creepy or intimidating. However, he was also beginning to worry about saying the wrong thing to Sam and ruining the night for Mary. He looked to Vasya and asked her, "What's this guy like, anyway?" Vasya thought about her response for a moment, wanting to make sure that she got it just right. Mary was watching her like a hawk, and Joe could feel how worried she was that Vasya would give him the wrong impression. "Sam is very nice," Vasya finally replied, "but I get the sense that there is more going on inside of him than he would like to admit." "What do you mean?" Mary looked Vasya in the eyes and started shaking her head, as though to stop Vasya from speaking, but Vasya ignored her. "I mean, he reminds me a lot of you," she said to Joe, while meeting Mary's glare. Mary appeared to approve of that comment and went back to figuring out all of the things that Joe wasn't allowed to talk about that night. "Don't talk about television," she warned him. "I don't plan to." Mary was about to say something else, but Joe felt a sudden chill wash over him. He was certain that when he exhaled, he would be able to see his own breath in front of him, but he was wrong. "Are you all right?" Vasya asked him, standing from her stool and putting a hand on his shoulder. "I'm fine. Why did it get so cold in here?" Vasya was confused. She looked to Mary, who was equally puzzled by what Joe had said, and turned back to him before answering. "It's not cold in here." Joe looked at her as though she were crazy and insisted, "It must have dropped 20 degrees just like that. How could you not feel it?" Before Vasya could say anything else, Mary looked toward the door and said, "He's here." She hurried away from Joe toward the door. Joe looked at Vasya and said, "How intimidating should I be?" "Don't," Vasya said with a stern expression, which lightened up as she added, "Much." Joe started to turn toward the door, but before he could make it all the way, he felt the strangest sense of confusion wash over him. It wasn't his own, but it didn't feel like any person he had ever met before. The confusion turned to relief as Joe looked toward Sam and Mary, who were walking his way. He tried to put on a smile, but the feelings were so unusual that he had a hard time pushing them away. "Joe?" Mary smiled, looking at him as though she would kill him right then and there if he didn't put on a friendlier expression. "This is Sam Dandridge. Sam, this is my sister's husband, Joe." Joe stood and extended his hand to Sam, putting on the best smile that he could possibly muster, but there was an urgency to that moment that he couldn't put his finger on. He felt it coming from someone in the room, but he wasn't sure who. He forced himself to sound normal as he said, "It's nice to meet you, Sam." "You too, sir," Sam replied nervously. Despite the fact that those feelings had started just as Sam entered the bar, he wasn't the person who those strange feelings were coming from. A ghost, Joe thought to himself, but he didn't let on. "You don't have to call me sir, Sam. I'm not her father." Joe smiled, gesturing toward a stool for Sam to sit down. "Yes, sir," Sam replied. "I mean, Joe, Mr. Oster." "Joe's fine," Mary told Sam, standing next to him and putting an arm around him as she kept that hawk's eye on Joe, waiting for him to say or do something wrong. Vasya was sitting on her stool, propping her head up with one arm on the bar and enjoying the show. There was silence. Joe wasn't sure what he was allowed to say if he wasn't allowed to talk about work or family. He couldn't remember whether Mary had told him to avoid politics or if that was just his memory of meeting her mother. "I've been to your bookstore," Sam finally offered. The way he said it was filled with relief, as though he was thankful to finally think of something to talk about himself. Joe looked to Mary, silently asking if he was allowed to talk about the bookstore with Sam. She nodded. "Yes, it's been in Mary's family for years," Joe told Sam. "I heard. Her father opened it, right?" "Yes," Joe nodded. "He did." "Who needs a drink?" Mary asked, already making her way behind the bar. Coffee, please," Sam told her. "Me too," Joe added. "Sam delivers mail," Vasya threw in, before standing up and smiling to the men. "Joe was mailman himself." Mary nearly spilled the coffee as she poured. Joe froze in place, waiting to be scolded for the topic coming up at all, even if he wasn't the one who raised it. Vasya gave the men a quick nod goodbye and then walked away from the bar. "You were a mailman?" Sam asked. "Yes, that was a while ago. I stopped when Mary's father died," Joe replied, then stopped to wonder if Mary had told him not to talk about Sam's family or any family at all. "Oh," Sam nodded. He felt uncomfortable with the subject after Joe mentioned the death. "Who wants food?" Mary asked them. "Sandwiches?" As she asked, she looked around the bar and then toward the back of the room. Her eyes eventually made their way back to the men as she said, "We stopped serving those, I think." Joe turned back to Sam, determined to fix this conversation by asking a new question. He just needed something completely safe for them to talk about, something so far removed from anything that Mary warned him about that he couldn't possibly strike a nerve. "So," Joe started before an idea popped into his mind. "Do you sail?" Mary dropped a cup of coffee onto the floor, causing it to shatter. She looked mortified as she shot Joe a dirty look and then dropped to the floor to clean up the mess. Sam stood and looked over the bar. He asked Mary, "Do you need help with that?" No, I think I have it," Mary replied, not bothering to look at him. Joe didn't know what he said wrong, but he could tell that he had stumbled into another bad topic. Sam was growing more uncomfortable by the second. Joe didn't know what he could do to fix this meeting, but he knew that he had to do something, and fast. As Joe thought long and hard, Sam leaned a little bit closer to him and whispered, "Did Mary give you a list of topics that you aren't supposed to discuss with me?" "Yes," Joe smiled, feeling relief at last. The same sense washed over Sam, who said, "She's been telling me all day not to talk about this or that. I'm so focused on all of the things that I'm not supposed to say, I'm scared to say anything at all." "How about we make a deal? Let's just talk, and if one of us says something that makes the other one uncomfortable, we just refuse to talk about it and move on with our lives." "Deal." "Good." Mary stood up, holding a bundle of dirty towels in her hand, and looked at them with a worried expression in her eyes. "Go to work, Mary," Joe told her. "We can take it from here." She looked to Sam, who gave her a nod. Then she reluctantly agreed and walked off to take orders from customers. "She's cute when she's nervous," Sam told Joe, before suddenly feeling uncomfortable again. "I shouldn't have said that." "It's fine. I had a feeling that you might like her," Joe smiled. "And I know how you feel. When I was dating her sister, I couldn't say a word without it being the wrong word. Her parents nearly kicked me out of the house. How did you finally win them over?" "I gave them a granddaughter," Joe smiled, but his smile faded as an image of Maggie's face rushed into his head. His heart tightened. Seeing Joe's mood change so suddenly, Sam grew uncomfortable and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, that was on the list." Joe put his hand up and shook his head. It took him a moment to find the right words to say, but he finally told Sam, "I don't mind talking about them as much as people think I do. Mary worries too much." Sam smiled, and his eyes drifted over to a table where Mary was taking an order. As he looked at Mary, Joe could feel how Sam felt about her. It was a strong feeling, which he recognized right away. It was the same way he felt about Mary's sister, years earlier. The feeling took Joe back. It made him remember what it was like to be in love. It seemed like all he ever felt anymore was the negative side of things. He felt the loss of Norma. He felt loneliness. He felt pain. But for that quick, fleeting moment, he remembered what it was like when things were good. The feeling was cut off by a sudden sense of panic. Joe felt like he needed to get up. He urgently needed to do something, but he didn't know what. He'd felt like this before, the night Annalise was hit by the car. It was a feeling with the same sharpness as the terror that he felt that night, but this wasn't terror. He felt like he needed to do something very important, but this feeling lacked the pull of that terror. Whereas he was being drawn somewhere before, this was just a general sense of panic. His heart was pounding in his chest. His palms were sweating. He felt like he was going to have a heart attack, but he wasn't. If this was a ghost that he was feeling, it was a ghost who needed something desperately. It was a ghost who was alone and scared and unable to communicate with anyone. "Are you all right?" Sam asked, now looking at Joe and seeing how disturbed he was. Joe pushed the emotions back. It was harder than usual, but he fought to regain his own senses for the sake of not looking like a fool in front of Mary's new boyfriend. "I'm fine," Joe said. He then smiled and tried to look less sickly as he joked, "Still waiting on that coffee, but I'm fine otherwise." Joe pulled his cigarette case from his pocket and gave one to Sam before taking one for himself. As the men lit their cigarettes, Joe asked, "What was I saying?" Sam replied, growing a little bit uncomfortable. Joe could tell that he didn't want to answer. Joe raised a finger and nodded. "Right. I was saying that I was perfectly fine talking about my dead wife right before I lost my mind." He took a long drag of his cigarette and allowed the smoke to sit in his lungs for a second or two before letting it go. He told Sam, "I think that talking about them makes it hurt less sometimes, almost like they're still here." A wave of uneasiness washed over Joe. It wasn't the raw emotion of the ghost or whatever it was that he felt in the room that night. This was from Sam. It seemed as though he nearly choked when Joe spoke that last sentence. Sam looked toward Mary again. He seemed to do it every time he wanted to feel more at ease. "I hear you went to the fair the other day," Joe said, changing the topic for Sam's sake. Sam nodded and said, "It's an interesting place. Have you been?" "Not yet. I've been a bit busy lately." "Right. Mary was telling me that you're consulting. I don't think she ever said what sort of consulting, though." "Consulting? Is that how she phrased it?" Joe asked with a smile. He shook his head as he said, "I suppose it's as good a word as any." "I'm not sure I follow. Do you read the paper very often?" "Yes." "Do you remember a story about that missing boy, Teddy Dowling?" Sam thought for a moment and then nodded. "He was found by a psychic, wasn't he?" Joe smiled again and flicked the ashes off of his cigarette. Sam's eyes lit up as he realized that Joe was the man who found the missing boy. He asked, "You're the psychic?" "Not a psychic, really. I just have a talent for knowing what people are feeling. So this woman comes to me. She asks me to find her missing sister. I say no, but the next thing you know, she's being run down by a car right in front of my shop. That's a hard thing to ignore." "I can imagine." "That's what I'm consulting on. So you deliver mail?" "Yeah," Sam replied, growing uncomfortable once again. "It's just a temporary job in my cousin's office until I can find something better." "It's honest work. There's nothing wrong with that." "It's not the sort of thing that people aspire to." "Like you said, it's just temporary. What do you aspire to?" "Oh," Sam said, looking down to the ground. He was uncomfortable with the topic. Joe regretted asking the question. "Never mind," Joe said. "There's plenty of time to figure it out, right?" Sam looked back to him, feeling embarrassed. He told Joe, "I don't mean to sound like I don't have any goals. It's just that things..." Joe was just about to tell Sam not to worry about it when another wave of urgency came over him. It was like someone was screaming for help in his ear, only he couldn't hear the words. He felt like he was being watched, but when he looked around the room, he saw nobody looking his way. "Excuse me for a second," Joe said to Sam as he stood from his stool. He was so distracted by this strange feeling that he didn't even look at Sam as he walked away. He took 2 steps before his head started to spin. It was like he was being drawn in every direction at the same time. He felt a need to run, but there was no direction to run in. He felt like panicking, but he wasn't sure why. And then he felt like he needed to throw up. Mary saw Joe rushing toward the bathroom, and she could tell that something was wrong. He looked as pale as a ghost, which seemed fitting considering the reason why she had asked him to be there in the first place. Since she couldn't very well follow him into the bathroom, Mary turned her attention toward the bar, hoping to find Sam sitting there, but his stool was empty. She looked toward the door, just in time to see it closing. "No," she said to herself. "No, no, no." She started walking toward the door, passing Vasya along the way. "Is everything okay?" Vasya asked, though Mary was already past her by that time. Without slowing down or turning around, Mary told Vasya, "Sam's just not used to Joe." "Ah," Vasya replied in a matter-of-fact tone. Mary rushed through the door and found Sam walking away from the bar. She hurried to catch up to him and stepped in front of him, blocking his path and forcing him to stop. "Don't leave," she pleaded. "I shouldn't be here. Joe's right." "He said that?" "No, but he was thinking it." Mary paused and then asked, "Wait, are you a mind reader?" Sam sighed and looked up to the sky as he told her, "No. You don't have to be one to see that he didn't like me, and why should he? I'm no good for you, Mary. I'm a mess, and that mess isn't going away anytime soon. We're all a mess, in case you couldn't tell." "Not like me," Sam said, looking as though he was about to break down right there. "My job isn't good enough for you." "Your job is fine with me. And even if it wasn't, that's just your job. It isn't you." "Yeah, well, I'm not good enough for you either." "Why would you think that?" "Because I have the paperwork to prove it, signed by the government certifying that I'm not good enough for you or anyone else. I don't know why I tried to fool myself into thinking that I was." Mary had no idea what he was talking about. She could tell that he was trying to tell her something important, but she didn't understand it. All she could do was look at him, silently asking him what he was trying to say. Sam seemed to deflate. Whereas he had seemed so determined to get out of there before, and so angry with himself, he now looked weak and unsure. He asked her, "Do you know what a Section 8 is?" She shook her head. "It's a type of discharge from the military. It's how they get rid of people that they deem unfit for duty." "Unfit?" "Mentally unfit. Crazy." "You're not crazy, Sam." "Tell that to my superiors," Sam responded. He took a step back and then turned to look at the wall, as though an image was being projected onto it. "What happened?" she asked him, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Please tell me what happened." In a quiet voice, he told her, "The Hindenburg." She had heard of the Hindenburg, of course. Everyone had. She had seen the reports in the newspaper, with the pictures of the explosion. It was horrible, but she still didn't know how it fit into Sam's story. She didn't know why he would be discharged from the Navy because of it. It took a few moments for him to think of the right way to continue with his story, but he finally told her, "I was there that night. Most nights, really. I had a job in Hangar 1, keeping track of supplies and that sort of thing. It wasn't much more than I do now, but it felt like more, you know? It felt like I had a purpose. I put that uniform on, and my life mattered." As he told the story, a smile came over his face, and he turned to Mary as he said, "Did you know that it can snow inside of one of those hangars? It's so big it can snow in there, even when it's not snowing outside. Even in the city, I've never seen anything that was as astonishing as the inside of that hangar when it was empty. Just the sheer size of it. And then you put an airship in there, and you would think that it would feel small and cramped because they're so enormous. But it wasn't. Even with a ship inside, the hangar was... I can't even describe it." Sam looked away from the wall, as though the image had either faded or he didn't want to look anymore. Instead, he took a few steps away from Mary and turned to face her again. He met her eyes for just a moment before looking down to the ground. "My cousin, Harvey, worked at the base. He was a civilian, but he worked as a lineman. You know, the guys who tie the ships down when they land. He loved it. He loved that he got to see those ships every day, and he loved that he got to work in the same place that I worked. We grew up together, and after I joined the Navy, he thought we'd never see each other," Sam told Mary, before trailing off for a moment. He then added, "I got him the job." Mary wanted to ask what happened to Harvey. Even though she was sure that Sam was getting there, she had been wanting to know the answer to that question all day, but she couldn't bring herself to ask him directly, so she remained silent and listened to him. "It was raining that night," Sam continued. "The ship was late, 13 hours. I was ready to go, but Harvey had to work, and so I was waiting for him. I remember sitting inside where people from the press were gathered. Everyone was excited, but I just wanted to go. And then..." He closed his eyes, remembering the explosion and the crash. Mary could practically see it playing out in his expression. She couldn't help but tear up and put a hand over her mouth. "I ran outside, but there wasn't anything that I could do. I couldn't get there fast enough. I couldn't see Harvey, and that massive airship was reduced to nothing within seconds. It was just fire and smoke. And I tried. I tried so hard to get there in time. I tried to find him and make sure that he was all right, but I couldn't find him. I couldn't help him. Every time we pulled the survivor from the wreckage, I held my breath. But he wasn't there. I actually started to think that he might be alive. I thought that maybe he went off to do something and missed the whole thing. I started to think that he'd be inside laughing at me for panicking, but he wasn't. I didn't see him again until a while later when I went back to where the press was, and they'd brought all of the bodies inside. He didn't even look like himself anymore. His face was black and burned, and I knew it was him because he had this old good luck charm that he wore around his neck, and that's what I saw. That's how I knew it was him. That's how I knew that I had to go home and tell our family that he was dead, and it was my fault. It wasn't your fault, Mary told him, stepping closer, but worried that if she got too close he would run off like a scared rabbit. I got him that job. He wouldn't have been there without me. And you know the part that really bothers me? He asked. Mary shook her head but said nothing. The papers. They said that there was one person on the ground who died, not two. They didn't even mention that he was there. He was right there in the same spot where all of the reporters were standing, and none of them took the time to care. Sam stopped talking and glanced toward the sidewalk. Mary couldn't tell whether he wanted to leave or he was checking to see if anyone was coming. He then stepped closer to Mary and lowered his voice as he asked, "Do you really want to know why they think I'm crazy?" She nodded yes, though she wasn't sure that she wanted to hear what happened next. Pictures ran through her mind of Sam screaming and pulling his own hair out. She'd read a lot of books in her life, and a lot of them involved characters who had been deemed crazy. She didn't enjoy imagining Sam's face on those characters. Sam swallowed hard and then told her, "It started the day after his funeral. I was in bed just waking up. You know, that moment in the morning when you're not asleep anymore, but you're not quite awake either." Mary nodded again. She found herself growing nervous. "I heard him call my name," Sam told her. "Clear as day, I heard him yell my name. So I shot out of bed and looked around thinking that something was wrong. I didn't even remember that he was dead for a few seconds. When I did remember, I thought it was a dream, wishful thinking. The next night I couldn't sleep. I kept remember hearing him call my name, and I wasn't scared by it. I just couldn't stop my mind from working. I kept running through the crash, trying to figure out what I could have done differently, how I could have saved him. Whenever I closed my eyes and started to drift off, I saw the crash, the giant airship overhead, the sky in flames for as far as the eye could see. I could feel the heat on my face, the dream was so vivid. I could hear the screams. See, I wasn't seeing the crash from where I was in the hangar. I was seeing the crash from Harvey's point of view, over and over again." Mary put a hand on Sam's arm and told him, "It was a dream. I had dreams like that when my sister died." "I know that. I know it was a dream," he told her. "But every night I saw the same thing, and I never got any sleep. For weeks, months. And then things would happen." He trailed off, trying to find the right way to explain what he was talking about. He seemed to be struggling to find the right words that would make her understand. When he spoke, he told her, "I told you that I worked with supplies, right?" She nodded. "Well, one day I was taking inventory, seeing what we needed. I had a clipboard and a pencil, and I was keeping track of it all, but a light bulb went out, so I put my things down and I went to change it. When I got the light back on and I went back for my things, my pencil was gone. I looked everywhere for it. I looked under desks and cabinets. I checked my pockets. I nearly tore the place apart looking for the pencil. You know where I found it?" Mary shook her head just slightly, waiting for the answer like a child sitting around a campfire. "On my pillow," Sam told her. "Your pillow?" "I took off my jacket that night and tossed it on my bed. Then I notice the pencil is sitting on my pillow. So I figure that I must have stuck it in my pocket and forgot about it. I thought I was just tired and didn't remember putting it there, and it fell out of my pocket later that night." "But that's not what happened?" Mary asked, urging him to continue. "I don't know," Sam replied, trying his best to explain what never made sense to him. "Maybe it was what happened, but it kept happening. My comb moved from the sink to my pocket. I had a pair of socks sitting on my bed. Next thing I know, they're on the floor. I had Harvey's necklace in my trunk, and the next thing I know, it's on top of the trunk. I tried to ignore it. I tried to hide it from everyone else. I thought I was tired and I wasn't paying attention to what I was doing, so I kept making mistakes. But it never stopped. And the longer it went on, the more tired I was, and then people started asking me what was happening. And I made the mistake of telling them." Mary finally understood all of the little things that she had been wondering about Sam. Why he didn't like to talk about his time in the Navy, why he avoided discussing Harvey, why he never seemed comfortable in his own skin. She understood all of it, but she wasn't sure that he did. "Harvey," she said in a quiet voice, almost afraid that Sam would explode at the mere mention of the name. "He never left." Sam looked at her and almost said something, but he stopped himself. He smiled, more nervously than from finding anything funny about this conversation, and he said, "Except he did. He died, and the rest of us were left here picking up the pieces." "But he never left," Mary said again, hoping that Sam would catch on to what she was saying so that she wouldn't have to put it more bluntly. Unfortunately, Sam didn't catch on. He looked at her as though she were speaking another language, waiting for her to explain herself. So she did. Wringing her hands together, Mary turned away from Sam so that she wouldn't have to look him in the eyes as she said, "When you were on television the other night, there was a man behind you. I noticed him because he seemed so scared, so alone, and even though I couldn't hear anything that he wanted to say, it was as though his eyes were screaming for help." "There was nobody like that with me," Sam replied. "There was," she argued, turning toward him. "And when we got to your apartment and I began looking at your family pictures, I saw the same man. And then Sid told me who it was." Sam shook his head just slightly, taking a step back. "I don't want to hear this." "It was Harvey," she said. "So, you see, you're not crazy, Sam. You're no more crazy than any of us. Harvey is here. He's with you." "Stop," Sam said, in a tone that she'd never heard him take before. It was angry and defensive. He then softened and said, "Please, stop." "But this means that you're not crazy. It means that my cousin has spent the past 2 years screaming for help and I couldn't hear him. It means that every nightmare I've had was real. It means that I didn't just fail him that night. I've failed him ever since." "But," Mary began, but she didn't know what to say. She couldn't imagine what it would feel like to know that her sister or niece were begging for help from people who would never hear them. In all of her hurry to answer her own questions raised by what she had seen, she never thought that those answers might hurt Sam. "I have to go," he told her. "Sam, please don't. Stay. Maybe Joe can help you. Maybe—" "I have to go," he told her again, before looking at her and touching her hand with his for just a moment before turning and walking away. She wanted to follow. She wanted to make things better somehow, but she didn't know how. All she could do was watch him leave. Roy had spent most of his evening walking. Then he grabbed a quick bite to eat in one of the local diners, and once he was done there, he walked some more. He never made it far. He just kept walking in circles, trying to clear his mind, but he couldn't. It was good that Mary was happy. She probably would have been miserable with him anyway, and he'd already blown the one chance that he had to impress her. He'd blown it by being the man that he would always be, and that was probably why he didn't have people falling all over themselves to be his friend. His own parents had tossed him aside when he was a baby, and nothing had changed since then. He just needed to focus on the work now. He needed to figure out the next step in his investigation into a story that he'd been ordered to drop. Maybe he could figure out where Leah Meyer hung around and talk to people who knew her. The work was what mattered. Roy slipped his hand into his pocket as he thought about his plans for the next day. He was reaching for the wooden cross that he always carried with him, but all he found was a couple of dimes. He reached into another pocket, but found no cross there either. It wasn't in any of his pockets, but that didn't make sense. It was always there. He never left the thing at home, and this meant that he must have lost it somewhere along the way. "No," he said under his breath. No. It was a stupid little trinket, given to him by people who never cared in the first place. Yet it was all he had. It was the only thing that had followed him from the train station where he was found to the orphanage to where he lived now. He hated that he needed the thing, but he did need it. Stupid as it was the closest thing he had to family. His eyes were searching the sidewalk around him, but he was one man standing in the middle of a city street. This thing would be impossible to find, but he had to. He needed to retrace his steps and search everywhere. Fortunately, he remembered having it earlier in the day when he was waiting for Mary at the bar, and he'd been wandering around the same neighborhood like a fool ever since. So he retraced his steps, keeping his eyes on the sidewalk and hoping that his silly keepsake wouldn't be picked up by a kid or swept up by a shopkeeper. He went to the diner, but it wasn't there. He looked behind the newspaper racks, but still found nothing. Eventually, Roy wound up in the last place that he remembered having the cross, the alley outside of the Capitol. It was dark now, and the alley was hidden in shadows, but he had to do his best. He pulled out his lighter and searched, but he could barely see a thing. So he crouched down, closer to the ground, and looked even harder. That was when the door to the Capitol opened and closed, and Roy saw Mary's new boyfriend leaving. He looked upset. Mary soon followed after him, and the two proceeded to have a very strange, yet intriguing, conversation.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn.